All right, folks, hello and welcome back to online English class. Today we're going to be working on OTN 6, which analyzes part 2, chapters 9 through 10. And we're going to be looking at the significance of Winston's engagement with Emmanuel Goldstein's book. All right, before we do that, let's quickly remind ourselves of some top of the week announcements. You need to make sure that you are completing your discussion grade procedure on a daily basis. The next thing that you need to do is make sure that you're continuing your reading of part 3, chapters 1 through 3. You need to send email confirmation of your completion of OTNs 2, 3, and 4 by 3 p.m. on Wednesday of this week. That's today. And then aside from that, continue to work through your OTNs as we complete them in class. Contextualizing this is your ongoing work on your quarter 4 essay, which is due anytime from May 18th to May 22nd. All right, so let's go ahead and turn our attention back to OTN 6. In this section of text, which we've already conducted our SQ3R4, all right, Orwell continues to develop the significance of Winston's attempt to achieve freedom, his rebellion against the totalitarian and dehumanizing control of the party. Now, one of the most important moments, the kind of apex moment of Winston's rebellion, comes in and around the time in which he is reading the book, Emmanuel Goldstein's book. Okay, so we want to spend some time thinking about the significance of that book and what that book represents to Winston as a rebel. All right, so on page 184, Winston begins to describe, or it is narrated, Winston's engagement with the book. All right, so he's just spent an incredibly long work week, 90-hour work week, rewriting the history of Oceania to make sure that there is no record of their ever having been at war with Eurasia, that they've always been at war with East Asia, and then retreating from that insanity right after getting a sort of early day off work at the end of the week after exhausting labor. Winston returns back to Mr. Charrington's shop, and he opens up the book given to him by O'Brien, which is a record of Emmanuel Goldstein's analysis of oligarchical collectivism, which is the party's governing ideology, and it analyzes both the theory, okay, how it works, and also the practice, how that theory is employed or practiced in society. Okay, the book is described as a heavy black volume, amateurishly bound. In other words, it isn't professionally published. That's because in Oceania, obviously, all books are published by the government, and they are all sort of vetted by the government. They are controlled by the government. All right, there's no title on the cover. The print looks slightly irregular. Again, it's just amateurly published. The pages were worn down at the edges, which seems to signal that someone's been reading this quite often, all right, and fell apart easily, as though the book had passed through many hands. Okay, so in other words, this description of the book seems to suggest, all right, that the Brotherhood has passed this book around. That this copy of the book, this copy of these, this record of thought crime has passed through many hands, and that the Brotherhood has many members, and all of them share this sort of common value of human life and what human beings were created to do, and the ways in which the party just governs them unjustly. Right, the title page, right? It is the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism. In other words, this book, written by Emmanuel Goldstein, whose name literally means God with us, this kind of messianic or Christ figure that Winston looks to right the wrongs of his society, okay, to build a kind of brotherhood, a kind of community, very similar to the Christian church, that will act as redeemers of and co-laborers with their sort of Messiah figure, Emmanuel Goldstein, to redeem the world and to spread the good news that human beings do not have to live as slaves, that freedom is indeed not slavery, that war is indeed not peace, and ignorance is indeed not strength, that these statements are untrue, and that there is a better way to live and a better way to govern ourselves. Okay, the title itself suggest that Goldstein is going to explain the party's ideologies, right? Instead of simply unconsciously submitting to those ideologies as the party requires their citizens to do through the use of doublethink, all right? Instead of simply reasoning himself into an unreasonable submission to ideas that are clearly not true, self-evidently not true, Goldstein, as all the Brotherhood members do, are going to analyze these concepts, to consciously reflect on these concepts, and in doing so, be free. All right? So the book itself is representative of a couple important things in Winston's rebellion, both intellectually and also emotionally. Okay, so first, intellectually, all right, the book is representative of a first and foremost a kind of record that defies the party's control of reality. Unlike every other record in Oceania's society, all right, this book suggests that the party is not perfect, that the way that they rule is not only understandable, analyzable, and therefore capable of being evaluated. And if capable of being understood and analyzed and evaluated, also capable of being valued as bad. And if capable of being valued as bad, right, worthy to be fought against. Okay, do you see that line of reasoning there? Analysis leads to understanding. Understanding leads to evaluation. Evaluation leads to the free judgment of whether or not something is good or bad. If it is bad, then you should what it? You should change it. Okay, so this is a record of a kind of consciously a conscious line of reasoning that the party is not in control of, but rather actually literally defies and negatively evaluates the party's control. Okay. The next thing that the book represents intellectually is a conscious analysis of the slogans, all right, of the ideas that are at the basis of Oceania's society. As I've already stated, instead of simply unconsciously obeying the party, which, as noted in part one, by Syme, all right, the guy who was working on the Newspeak dictionary that Winston had a conversation with at lunch while at work one day, that orthodoxy, in other words, perfect obedience to the party, is unconsciousness, right? That's what Syme said. Instead of unconscious, which is to say no thought, no conscientious thought. Instead of thoughtless obedience to these principles, instead of thoughtless acceptance of the ways in which these principles are self-evidently incorrect, self-evidently contradictory, and also, by extension, self-evidently unjust, immoral, and not good. Okay? Instead of simply unconsciously accepting that, right, as the majority of members of Oceania's society does, okay, what the book does is it analyzes these concepts. It consciously reflects on these concepts. And very similar to Winston's journal, way back in chapter 1, another kind of record, another kind of conscientious analysis of his internal life, this book, all right, is kind of a conscientious analysis of the life and the ideology of Oceania's society as a whole, okay? Connecting Winston's personal rebellion to this larger external society-wide rebellion, all right, that is sort of rooted in the ideas articulated by the book that binds together the brotherhood, okay? All right? Now, it doesn't just connect to Winston intellectually, however, right? The book also connects to Winston on an emotional level, right? Very much like the themes of this book as a whole, Winston's rebellion is both in his mind and also in his heart, okay? The human creature is both an emotional and an intellectual creature, both a spiritual, all right, and a kind of material creature. All right. And so the book also ministers to his heart or his spirit as well. It makes him feel like he is a part of a community of rebels. All right, it literally connects him to the brotherhood. It makes him feel like he's reading something that many other people have also read and understood and put their hope in. Okay, very similar to the kind of feeling of connectivity given to faithful Christians who meet together, all rallying under the truth and the good news and the hope articulated in the Word of God about the gospel, right? So very similar to that experience, which is not just an intellectual experience. It is an intellectual experience, something that you judge to be true in your mind. But it's also something that fills your heart, that ministers to your soul, that ministers to the emotional components of you as a human being, knitting you together in a kind of community that is based on similar belief systems, and that cultivates a kind of love. All right, so he's connected to this kind of intellectual tradition that ministers to his needs for community. All right, all of this leads to the conclusion at the end of chapter 9 that Winston says, and that is that sanity is not statistical, simply because the majority of members of Oceania's population accept the tyrannical control of the party. Whether because they're just not thoughtful enough to have reasoned through why it's not okay, or because they are too afraid to rebel. The fact is, the majority of members of his society do not feel the same way, but that does not mean that there are not other individuals who do feel the same way, who do see the same things that Winston has seen, and therefore he's not insane. Okay, rather he and the brave few, the sane few, okay, the loving few are together fighting the good fight, a good fight for the truth. All right, all those words are very important. The good fight for the truth. Okay. Now, to deepen these impressions, right, I want to talk a little bit about the actual chapters in the book themselves. All right, in Goldstein's book, which I find this portion of the narrative extremely interesting. Some students find this portion very tedious, okay, because it breaks from the narrative. The characters aren't doing anything, but rather Goldstein is just analyzing ideas conscientiously, okay? So the first idea that he analyzes extensively that Winston read through is the idea that war is peace. Now, on the face of things, that statement is just simply what? Wrong. It's just not true. It's just incorrect. Okay, but Goldstein is going to analyze this statement instead of just simply unconsciously accepting it. He's going to analyze the statement and make it make sense. All right, and we too are going to analyze the statement and make it make sense. All right, so he begins his description. All right, this slide is just going to summarize Goldstein's thoughts about the concept or the paradox, war is peace. All right, so he begins in this portion of the narrative. All right, so all of this is just communicated in these pages here around page 180, 190. Okay, that the three superstates, Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia, all which it is implied were created after World War II. So World War II comes and devastates basically the Western world. And also portions of the Eastern world, right? The world is sort of embroiled in this massive, chaotic war. And at the end of it, right, what happens is, unlike actual history, but sort of like actual history, the world is carved up into three superstates, okay? This map is a little bit hard to see because it's dim, but I'll help you see it a little more clearly, all right, with an outline, okay? And the three superstates are Oceania, which is the United States, which absorbs England or Britain. This is where Winston Smith lives, right? And Oceania is part of the United States, part of South America, and also part of Australia, and sort of the portions of South Africa here. And East Asia, right, which encompasses China, the northern reaches of India, all right, and certain portions of Western Asia, and then Eurasia, which basically spans Russia, that absorbs Western Europe and Eastern Europe into it as well. Okay, so the three superstates of the world are constantly fighting with one another for control of these territories. These are the disputed territories that are constantly being colonized and exploited for labor by these three different superstates. Okay, but here's the problem. Here's the thing that makes this war between them make very little sense. All right, first of all, Goldstein explains that because of the geographical terrain, the fact that oceans separate these powers, and the fact that the populations of each one of these areas of the world are so extensive, right? That there's so many millions of people living in each one. The armies are so large, and all of them have nuclear weapons, right? That because of this fact, winning a war against another nation is essentially impossible. Okay, so you cannot win, right? All you can do is fight constantly. Sure, you can take these territories from the occupying powers. You can beat them back, but you cannot. Goldstein reasons, which is pretty true in modern military terms as well. You cannot completely conquer one of these nations, all right, due to the geographical realities and also the presence of nuclear weapons. It would cost you too much, all right, if you really cornered. For example, if the United States, even today, went to war with a massive superpower like China or Russia, it would cost us too much, all right, to completely defeat and destroy the Russian or the Chinese nations, and vice versa, right? There is mutually assured destruction implied or entailed in a war between these superpowers, all right? So all that they do is fight kind of proxy wars in these less powerful regions of the world that they can lose without necessarily losing control of their own territories, okay? The other thing that makes these wars make very little sense is that they're materially unnecessary, okay? So traditionally, war mostly is fought for control of valuable natural resources, okay? So when you're fighting a war, you're typically fighting against other groups of people for some kind of wealth, for something that you need. But you see, in these superstates, all right, instead of being like, for instance, a small feudal kingdom fought by a small feudal lord who's just looking for a few more fertile fields so that his kingdom is a little more wealthy, so that his life is a little more stable. If you look at these superstates, all of them have access to plenty of natural resources. The ecologies are diverse enough. There are reserves of all of the major resources in each one of these territories. They don't need to fight one another for material, okay? All right, so once again, very similar to actual real life, the United States doesn't need to go and conquer Russia in order to have enough material resources for our economy to flourish. It's just not a material necessity. And then finally, the last reason why people fight, why nations fight, is competing ideologies. Okay, so think about, for example, World War II. Was the United States and the Allied powers fighting against the Germans for natural resources? Were the German people starving to death and the United States citizenry starving to death, and they just needed access to those fields or oil reserves or iron ore reserves? No. Okay, what World War II was at the basis of a fight about was competing ideologies. All right, Nazi totalitarianism and Aryan racism versus racial equality. All right, and liberal governing structures. That's what World War II was really about. It was a battle between competing ways of thinking or ways of believing. But interestingly, all three superstates are oligarchical, collectivistic, totalitarian dictatorships. All three of them call it different names, okay? Eurasia is governed by an ideology called Neo-Bolshevism. East Asia is governed by an ideology called the death cult or the death of the self. And the Oceania is governed by the ideology or the principle of INGSOC. All of them are simply collectivistic, oligarchical, totalitarian governments. So, in other words, they're not fighting because of competing ideologies. So, why are they fighting? Well, ironically, as Goldstein explains, to keep the peace. For the party, warfare is about using machine technology, in other words, modern technology and factories, which are used by the party to give the members of their society something to do, right? That's one way of keeping the peace in their society and maintaining their power. They need to have them work. But if they're working in factories in a competitive economy, all right, ultimately, what's going to happen to the standard of living? It's going to improve. All right, machine technology leads to improvements in the standard of living as goods are cheaper and more easily produced, and technology increases, and people's access to pleasure and better lives becomes expanded. Okay, well, you can't do that because then the hierarchy on which the party's control is based is deconstructed. All right, you get this bulging middle class who wants to assert their rights. And then suddenly you've got a group of people who want to replace their rulers, all right, with a increasingly liberal or better form of government. Right? You can't have that. So what do? You use war to produce with using machine technology goods that are then destroyed constantly, perpetually, and infinitely by warfare. Okay? It also creates a kind of frozen state, a constant state of emotional crisis, because the society as a whole is constantly in a state of fear that if they do not obey their leaders, that there will be instability, and that if they do not obey their leaders, then they very well could be conquered by the evil Eurasians or the evil East Asians. All right? So the wastefulness of war and the consistency of the war seems reasonable. Okay? That's why the party shoots rocket bombs at London at their own people, okay, to make sure that they're in a frozen state of emotional crisis. Okay, that's one thing that Julia suspects, and that she is right in suspecting, is that it's probably not Eurasia that's bombing the people. It's probably the party themselves. Okay, freezing them in a kind of constant state of crisis. And then finally, it freezes science and technological advancements, which are supposed to help human beings thrive. Okay, what's the point of a computer? To make life easier, to make sharing data, sharing information, creating documents, sharing any kind of experience online, making videos, doing school during a crisis. It's to make life better. Okay, but what does the constant state of war do? It reorients that natural, instinctual human process of improving life. All right, it orients it toward destruction and continued oppression. Okay, so in other words, the constant warfare is not a reasonable war. All right, that leads to human innovation or a negative consequence of human stupidity. All right, so stupid leaders get into wars and then they're punished for their stupidity by losing it. Okay, whereas good men and women fight war, just war, against bad ideologies, like for instance World War II, in which the Allies fight against the bad ideologies, and that leads to innovation, and that leads to improvement of life for human beings as a whole, as we don't have leaders like Hitler. Okay, now, does that mean the United States is perfect? No, but it's better than the Nazi regime. Okay, so war is no longer about the clash of ideas, competition for natural resources, or conflict at all. It's not about conflict. Paradoxically and ironically, war is rather the most peaceful The most stable way of maintaining the long-lasting totalitarian control of the three indistinguishable superstates that all mutually prop up each other's existence. So they are, in this sense, simultaneously enemies and allies. Hence, war is peace, enemy is friend. Okay? So Goldstein's analysis of that concept sort of invites Winston and the members of the Brotherhood to see the ways that the party uses warfare as an exploitive tool. All right, and what they mean by war is peace is that this is the best way to maintain our peaceful, stable control of our docile population. Okay, the next paradox that he analyzes, and I'll go quickly through this one because we're running out of time, is that ignorance is strength. Okay, so Goldstein begins his analysis of this concept, another fascinating analysis, by saying that all throughout history there has been a consistent sort of cycle of power in which the high may attempt to maintain their control, the middle, those who are in the middle of being peasants or slaves, the middle class attempts to replace the high, okay, and the low attempts to deconstruct the hierarchy as a whole, okay? This is the basic structure or foundational structure of the class struggle in the world. Okay, and it more or less reflects historical realities. So by the 20th century, people had recognized this pattern. And so what the high individuals attempted to do, all right, is freeze this cycle, all right, to freeze history in a permanent state of inequality instead of this constant struggle between high, middle, and low, to freeze this constant cycle with them at the top, with the party at the top. Okay, so how do they accomplish this state of frozen history? Okay, well, first, by collectivizing property and abolishing all standards of comparison. Okay, so everyone in Oceania's society has about the same amount of not that much. Why? Because there is no standard by which to compare your relatively crappy life to a better life. The only individuals who have access to luxury are the inner party members, and they live very separate lives from the normal party members, right? That's why it's so significant that Winston develops a friendship with O'Brien. It crosses those class lines, and he sees all of the luxuries and privileges that O'Brien has, and it further cements the idea that there is deep inequality in Oceania's society, and that inequality is unjust. All right, by destroying and collectivizing property, by making sure that the party owns everything, and therefore no one owns anything really. All right, it destroys any kind of material motive for achieving a kind of change in which the material components of life are more equally or reasonably distributed. Okay, it also affirms that the ruling class, the party, is perfect. And Big Brother, who is this disembodied, infallible figurehead of the party, is also perfect. Okay? In other words, Big Brother isn't real. Big Brother's not a real person, if you haven't caught on to that yet. He's not an actual person. He is created by the inner party members, okay, as a kind of disembodied, infallible figurehead of the party, right? And therefore, right, by using this sort of disembodied figurehead, all right, they have the ability to state that this person who doesn't exist, right, has never been wrong about anything ever. He's infallible, right, and his history is constantly being rewritten because he is ultimately just a fiction. He's a character in the party's fiction. All right. Now, they also continue their dominance by offering intellectual freedom to those with no intellect, the proles. Okay. In other words, the proles are not educated. It doesn't mean they're not human. It doesn't mean they're stupid. It means that they haven't been educated to think about abstract concepts like justice. They haven't been trained in knowing anything about history. Right? And so, very, very unlike you are being educated. And as you are being educated, you're reading books about issues of justice. You're learning history. You're developing a kind of historical sense that allows you to evaluate and judge the justice of your community and society and civilization. Well, the proles don't have that opportunity, and so therefore, they're perfectly free to think what they want, because they are not capable of thinking thoughts that would undermine the control of the party. And those who have intellect, those who are educated, the party members, they have complete and utter intellectual oppression. And if they have any thought crime, they are completely destroyed, right? All of this is dependent on doublethink, okay, which allows party members to use carefully trained intellectual faculties to destroy human intellect, okay? In other words, the higher you go up in the party, the more you have to doublethink, all the way to the point where those who created Big Brother, who is not real, have to doublethink their way constantly into forgetting that they forgot that their leader is fake and that they are fallible, right? And when they do this, they achieve a kind of freeze over history that makes their control, ironically, permanent. All right. This alters a fundamental portion of humanity as they use careful thinking. Okay, that careful thinking is one of the fundamental elements of being a human. Just so you know, right? To carefully evaluate and judge and to analyze your circumstances. But careful thinking is no longer done in the pursuit of knowledge or true belief. Okay, so knowledge of the environment, like knowledge of 2 plus 2 equaling 4, or true belief, like, for example, this is just or this is good. Those are beliefs. None of those kinds of beliefs, none of those careful thinkings are used to benefit human life, but rather careful thinking is only used. The smartest individuals in Oceania's society use the philosophy that they have developed in order to destroy rational thought. Okay. In all these ways, right? Ignorance, okay, doublethink, forgetting reality, and forgetting the fact that you've forgotten reality is the strength of the party. It's what allows for the party to freeze history in their constant state of strength and control. Okay? Goldstein analyzes this concept, makes it understandable, and therefore makes it alterable. Okay? It's something that an individual can read, understand, and then conscientiously say that is either true, which this is obviously not a good thing, okay? That is either good or that is bad. If you can make that judgment, you are free. If you are making that judgment, you are committing a grievous thought crime that undercuts the heart of the control of the party. Okay, so here, as Winston reads this book, he is engaging in that very grievous kind of thought crime that was initiated all the way back in part 1. Okay, hope you guys have a great day. That's all we have for today. Tomorrow we'll be discussing the scene in which Winston and Julia are arrested. All right, and their rebellion grows increasingly complex as they are brought in by the thought police. Have a great day.